Well, so my name is Natalia Mendoza. Together with Miguel Fernandez de Castro, I'm co-director of Altar Centro de Investigación, which is a tiny independent nonprofit research center located in the town of Altar, which is something like 60 miles south of the U.S. border and the Tohono-O'odham Reservation. Altar is one of the main crossing points for undocumented migrants who decide to walk across the desert to take kind of the longest route across the desert. And so this particular session of the Deserting Talk series, it's very important for us. Right now, we have been trying to establish this conversation with people working in North Africa for a while, and we've been finding that it's proving to be very productive. And there are two main reasons why we think and we wanted to have this conversation across deserts or across continents or regions. And the first one is that the process known as border externalization, which is kind of the set of policies put forward by both the US government and the European Union to sort of delegate or subcontract or outsource the detention and repression of migrants to third so-called safe countries, has expanded the area that we can call borderlands significantly. And I don't know if you, Felipe, will agree, but in the case of Mexico, we can now say that all the way down to the border with Guatemala, the entire country is a borderland. And this is particularly true for migrants trying to reach the US border. So this means that the areas where forensic investigation and research needs to happen in order to locate and identify those migrants have expanded substantially. And if it used to be the case that there used to be this kind of field divide between forensic practitioners working, or border forensic practitioners working in Europe, who were mostly focusing their efforts on the sea, the Mediterranean Sea and the shores, which requires a very particular set of skills and ways of gathering data and evidence because you're in the ocean. While the people working around forensics and border forensics in the U.S. Mexico borderlands were being pushed or were following migrant routes to further and further remote places of the desert, right? So we had this kind of divide in which the comparison wasn't as straightforward because some people were working in the sea, whereas the other ones were working in the desert. But it seems that in the last couple of years, or perhaps a decade, because of border externalization, we see that the places where people who are moving, migrants, might die or disappear, include already the North Africa, the Saharan desert, the Sahelian borders, and most of Mexico. So this has, I think this makes the comparison and the conversation across deserts more and more urgent. I think this process of border externalization has also expanded the ways in which migrants die or disappear, unleashing or triggering a set of kind of related phenomena like trafficking, recruitment for militias, or recruitment as sicarios, or extortion, all these other kind of parallel processes related to the illicit economy around undocumented migration that I think are growing both in North Africa and in Mexico. And I think Felipe will have something to share about that, some recent research on those cases. The other reason why I think is, well, we think it's very important to have this conversation is because as of the last 2 years, we have seen more and more migrants of African origin coming through Sonora, trying to reach the US. So that two regions or the different routes are, the migration routes themselves are changing and are merging and are bringing together. So this, I think, kind of shows that it will be productive for practitioners and researchers to also start having more direct conversations and collaborations. So this is our first attempt, but we hopefully will have some more coming. And this is perhaps the first part of a longer conversation on this question of migrant deaths and disappearances and forensic efforts in both continents. So I'm gonna now just quickly introduce Filippo and Robin. Then we're gonna have them talk for roughly 50 minutes. I'm gonna I'm gonna only moderate this talk and let them be the, I mean, they are the experts and we invited them to share their knowledge. So that's what we're gonna do. And we're gonna walk through perhaps the three different stages that we can think of dividing the forensic investigation in terms of search, discovery, location, and then identification, and finally probable assigning accountability, probable cause of death, or those processes of assigning responsibilities. And finally, perhaps we could say something about mourning and memorialization. Okay, so 1 second, sorry. One of the things that Filippo and Robin have in common, aside from being both anthropologists, is that they have both worked in and out of academia and together and very directly with the families and organizations and practitioners and groups who are looking for a loved person who has disappeared. So that's a whole conversation in itself. How do you navigate from academia and into these other spaces? But we can maybe say a little bit about that. Filippo Furri is an anthropologist and a research fellow at the Institut Convergence Migration in Paris. Since 2012, he has worked on the question of people who have died or gone missing while moving. He has studied the evolution of forensic medicine apparatus at the national level. This is also something that he has in common with Robin, and has also worked directly with families and civil society organizations to support their efforts. He is a member of the Boats for People Coalition and has collaborated on this issue with Forensic Oceanography, Border Forensics, Euromed DRA, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Robin Reinecke is a medical anthropologist whose research explores social and political responses to deaths and disappearances. She has focused especially on forensic responses and has conducted ethnographic research and forensic anthropological practice in the U.S. Mexico borderlands for over 15 years. And since 2006, she has worked closely with the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner in efforts to identify unidentified human remains believed to be migrants. She now directs Proyecto Esperanza, a University of Arizona initiative that provides information and services to families of missing persons. She's currently working on her first book, With the Dead for the Living, Forensic Care in the U.S. Mexico Borderlands. She's Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Arizona. And she's also a dear friend and a member of Altar Centro de Investigación Consultative Board. So she's one of us. I'm going to start with Filippo, who is currently midnight Paris and has made an honor to be with us today.
I will try to share some images. Let me say just a word before. I'm working more on Mediterranean Sea, as you mentioned before, with many organizations because it's easier to see and to follow the situation. But we are trying to work also on the, let's say, similar situation as the desert. In order, we are working on the mountains in the Alps, for example. So in order to map and try to understand what's happening in the Alps, so it's not the same like the desert, but there is we can be. I mean, we can try to do a comparison with the desert and the Alps, for example, or the border between Poland and Belarusia, the forest. So these are a kind of desert, not the same desert, but the desert. But about the situation in, let me try to find my sorry, PowerPoint. The situation in the desert, let's say the desert means it's a very, very big area. When we talk about the desert in Africa, we have the desert, the Sahel is a very big region. So we have many different situations. So what I can say is that the capacity of the civil society actors in particular to map and to count the numbers of people missing or disappearing or die in the desert it's very difficult to map and to have an accountability. So maybe it's something different because we have many borders, we have many different landscapes. So it's not easy, but we can find a kind of, we can say that in some particular region, we can find more cases, and it's because of the, let's say, border regime or the externalization of the border regime. So the number of people missing or dying in the desert now is more close to the Algeria and Niger border in both sense, because you have a lot of cases of deportation and expulsion from Algeria to Niger. We had many cases during the period. Now this law, they canceled this law. The new government in Niger canceled this law, but during a period, the people, the passeurs, in French we say passeurs, so the Niger government introduced a law against the passeur. So the condition of movement was more difficult. So we had many cases of people who disappeared and died because of the accident, etc. So this is another let's say border very difficult, let's say. And now we have the case from the people, the expulsion, from Tunisia to Libya and to Algeria. So we had many cases of people lost or that just the army left in the desert. So we have many cases of people disappearing, and this is the escape. So what the first point is, here you see the numbers of the IOM Missing Migrant Project, talking about, counting the cases since 2014. And what is interesting is that, and this is if you zoom into the central, in the desert, let's say, we are not talking about the Western Africa coast, okay, with the Canary route, and not about the situation in the Mediterranean, but just if you focus on this central area. So we are, what is interesting is that the IOM decided to not show the borders. So it looks like strange images, but if you check the same area, you can see the border. So you can connect the case of dead and missing in the at the border with the situation, the geopolitical situation. This is one point I would like to underline, because the point, there is a very famous, let's say, point called point zero, was can you see was here, okay, at the border of Niger and Algeria, and where we had a lot of cases of people missing and died because of the tension, and because this border violence on the both sides. If you check the numbers, so what you can see is that if you go to the IOM database, so the missing migrant site, you can see that many cases are not recorded. And if you go deeper, and we have we are lucky because friends in Africa from Niger and Chad and Mauritania start a project called Alarm Phone Sahara, who start to record and collect information about missing people and dead people. And they start to report more cases. I just mentioned that in 2013 we had a case in Algeria, so the region I'm showing. Can you see here? they found 12 Syrians and 2 persons from Algeria died in this area, was inside the Algerian territory, but around they found in the same period 92 bodies. And if I mean, and this this number is not appearing in the IOM database because they start in 2014. But if you go in 2016, we have 2 more cases. One in the region of oh no, this is the way. So maybe go up in the region of like point zero region. We have 35 bodies found here, and then 2 in 2017 we had 44 bodies found around Agadez. So there is if you go deep and you go in touch, you are in touch with the local authorities, etc., you can find more cases than the cases who are reported by the IOM project. So this is the situation. If you probably you know this report is a report made by UNHCR, IOM, and Mixed Migration Center. What is interesting is that they are assume that this difficulty, the incapacity of the international organization to count the number of missing and dead migrants, because of the I mean, the characteristic of the land, no, the paysage is very difficult to map the route. The routes are changing, so it's very hard. But they say in this report that I'm seeing from January 2020 to March 2024, they report 1,180 cases. But they say in this report that probably the number of people dying and disappearing in the desert are the double than compared to the case in Mediterranean. So if you have a kind of idea of the numbers in Mediterranean, you can imagine how many people get just lost and disappear in the desert. So this is a very difficult. I mean, one of the difficulties of the work in the deserts, what they are trying to do. So let's say the Friends of Alan Prosar in particular, but many other organizations, small local organizations, is to try to map and record the cases. Just to give you few words about the reason, I mean, the situation. We can, I mean, in the same report, 42% of death is connected to accident, so by car and truck accidents, 24% because starvation, and 12% of cases, we are talking about the 1,180 cases, by violence perpetrated by the, let's say, state agent or by the different criminal organization working in the area and active in the area. So the problem of the I mean, the situation is characterized by the fact that it's very hard to track the movement of the people, and we have many cases of people who simply get lost because the GPS is not working, so it's very hard to trace and to ask the SOS, to send the SOS. In the Mediterranean, it's interesting the comparison we can do with the Alan Phone project in the Mediterranean. The Alan Phone is based on the capacity of the people on the move to ask for the support, to ask for alert, and is the mechanism who Alan Phone used to ask for help and alert the authority, etc. In the desert, the possibility to ask for help is not easy. So we have some cases when they are in the capacity to do it, but it's not easy. So this is the reason why we have many people who just get disappear into the desert, and if you check the different report about the cases, we are not able to, in the newspaper, on the media, etc., you found the bodies. So it's a kind of it's very hard to search for people. Get me? So if you find bodies, it's because you are finding bodies on the roads, on the different routes that you can see here. Routes are changing, so it's not easy to.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I always hear this saying of like the estimated deaths in the Saharan would be double than those recovered in the Mediterranean. So eager to talk with you more about all of that. I'm just finding my slides. There we go. Okay. Sorry. All right. Can you see that hopefully?
Yep.
So just a starting point, most scholars and, at the university and not at the university, and I know some people from No More Deaths, and we have an amazing community of researchers well outside of the university and people who are defending human rights of migrants in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona. So most of us tend to start this history in 1994 with the Clinton administration shift in border control strategies. I won't go into this super in depth, but just we have to historicize this. And so essentially, to summarize not that complicated history, but a lot of pages have been spilled about this, that a lot of ink has been spilled and pages that the Clinton administration, this was a shift to a more directly militarized approach on the U.S. Mexico border. And so one of the things that it did was it funneled or pushed migrants who were crossing the border into more remote parts of the desert borderlands. That's one thing that it did. But another thing that this shift in strategy did was it just an overall militarized approach. So the way that the Border Patrol apprehended migrants, chased migrants, interacted with the border, it became a very militarized process. And so that's really when we started to see a dramatic shift in the number of fatalities. Well, I should say the number of recovered remains per year, because we don't know how many fatalities. I just updated this map yesterday. This is from data from the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner, and it's a mapping project from Humane Borders, one of our wonderful local human rights organizations. So this gives you a sense of the geography of where remains are found. I'm happy to return to this to discuss anything, questions, but I'll just point out two things. So Tucson, where I am, is here, Nogales, Phoenix up there. This data only includes remains that have been investigated by the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner. So an accurate map of recovered remains would also include this region around Phoenix, because that's a different medical examiner office and they have different data keeping. The Humane Borders is working on collecting those data, but it's a bit inconsistent. Of course, it drops off at Mexico. And again, that's important to note. This is because it's Pima County data. That isn't because there are no deaths happening south of the border. And Natalia can speak to that context, Natalia Miguel, better than I can. I will just allude to the fact that generally it's more homicide kind of fatalities close to the border in the Mexican side of the Sonoran Desert. Whereas on the U.S. side, it tends to be more, accidental exposure kind of deaths. And I'll go into that. And the other thing I just wanted to point out is the density of these fatalities happening on the Tohono Reservation, which adds another socially complex element to all of this. These data have not been, this is from a report that my colleague and friend, Dr. Daniel Martinez, and I have worked on a series of reports, and we have not updated this graph, which we need to do. But just to give you a sense of, at least for Pima County data, This is 1990 to 1999, and you can really see the increase in fatalities following the militarized approach to the border. And I drop in the chat a couple of reports and a recent article. Well, there's a recent special issue through the Journal of Migration and Human Security, if you're interested. And I'll just point out one thing to look at there is after 2020, the Trump and Biden administration policies, there were some significant increases in certain types of deaths due to some of those post-pandemic and asylum restricting, stay in Mexico return to Mexico kinds of policies. And then just briefly, manner of death. And so, medical examiners, there's two types of discernment that are made here, two types of determinations that are made here. There's manner of death and cause of death. So manner of death is just the big five: homicide, suicide, natural, accidental, and unknown. And then under something like accident, I think it's very important to point out that accident includes, for instance, skeletal remains found in a very, in a desert area. You don't know what happened to that person necessarily to cause death. Sometimes the distinctions between unknown cause of death and accident, there's going to be some subjective calls there made by forensic pathologists. So you'll have those sorts of cases, but another thing that Dr. Martinez and I are looking into, and I'll put this article in the chat, we're starting to pay attention to how many of the cases overall, so this bigger number, how many of this number was there a law enforcement agent on the scene at the time of death? And that's important because we know through other kinds of research and community projects looking at law enforcement that unfortunately the militarization of law enforcement in the U.S. means that your chance of a fatal interaction once law enforcement arrive can go up, especially if you're a member of a criminalized population. So the things that we're finding here in our new project, we're looking at cases where someone died after being pursued by Border Patrol, someone who jumped off of a bridge, for example, or very reckless and dangerous apprehension methods. So again, I think we're really pushing back, and it's a thing to talk about, and maybe something we can discuss here is, we have to be very careful not to blame the desert. People have lived in the desert for thousands of years, flourished and thrived. And so, I would critique some of my past scholarship, just not being careful enough about this distinction that, certainly it is U.S. federal policy, yes, that compelled people through more remote areas of the desert. Absolutely, that happened. But we have to also be attentive to the fact that it was not just where the border was policed, but how people are chased, how people are treated when they're apprehended, how groups are scattered when Border Patrol uses helicopters. They often use tactics of terror that are designed to cause people to, run and panic. And people drop their backpacks, they drop their water, and they run off into the desert. So we have that kind of interaction documented both on the missing persons report side and on the circumstances of death side. It's going to be hard to get at a complete number around, those kinds of cases, but at least we're starting to pay attention. And we just have to remember how incredibly actively the U.S. federal government is in these landscapes. I mean, when you go down to Organ Pipe, or you go to Sasa Bay, or any of these areas where there's border in any area in the 100-mile radius close to the border, it's so incredibly heavily surveilled. There's so much, you will be seen, you will be surveilled. There's just a lot of activity. And so it's really more about, I look at it in terms of containment, and I'll pause there, but it's, it's not just, oh, people were funneled into dangerous parts of the desert where they got lost by themselves. It's more like they were contained in a dangerous part of the desert where they were heavily surveilled and got hurt and lost and separated. You know, people don't leave each other behind casually. Like if they forced to leave each other behind, migrants really protect one another, and they you know, none of us would want to leave somebody we've just spent like 2 weeks traveling with. So anyway, that's just to give a sense of just this first question of how people are being found and some of the numbers. And again, this is just for Southern Arizona. I don't have figures. Texas is really complicated. And so, you know, that's another whole can of worms that luckily some great colleagues are working on, but I'll stop there.
Do you want to start, Robin? Because maybe you have the situation in the desert it's different by states, so, but it's very far from the.
Sure.
It's not easy. So maybe you can start, Robin.
Sure. I'm just putting the link to, I think this is the Baribar article that you're mentioning, Natalia. And Karina, if you don't have access to that, please email and I'll send you the PDF. I just don't want to send you the version that's full of my notes. So yeah, here the discovery issue. So families have a very, very, very active role in this. And so families are calling, mostly they're doing this work remotely in my observation and experience. So mostly they're calling these many search and rescue groups that have emerged over the last 5 to 10 years. Prior to that, they had very limited options. So it would be more like calling Border Patrol, trying to get help that way. I do know some families who have searched the desert themselves. And thankfully, there's a number of civilian search and recovery, search and rescue groups that have emerged, like Águilas del Desierto. No More Deaths has work in this area. There's a lot of them. I'm going to miss half of them, so I'll be careful not to say them all. But Armadillos, there's so many. And they'll search, so they'll get calls from families, and if they have enough location information, they will they're incredible. They do incredible hiking through the desert, and they're very skilled at finding people. We're working on figuring out the percentage that are of the dead that are found by Border Patrol versus these other groups, and it's just a complicated question with the data that we have. But certainly a lot of the fatalities are found by Border Patrol, or Border Patrol, like I said, was there on site when the death occurred. But yeah, families are calling everywhere. And to me, they trigger not only the search in the desert area, but also the identification forensic search, which I know we'll talk about probably next. What else? One final thing I will say is, you know, something I think we can look at and think about more that we've failed to do, I think, so far, is the impact on the local community of having this volume of tragedy happening here. Obviously, this harms families and the migrants themselves more than anybody, but just in the records, it's really awful. I mean, imagine hiking or horseback riding, or you're out with your kids. There's a lot of cases of, you know, especially for Tohono residents, like the dog bringing something horrible to the backyard. Even people walking out in their backyard and smelling something. I mean, the landscape, the extent to which the landscape has been turned into a landscape of death and suffering is pretty remarkable and horrible. So I'll stop there. And yeah, I'm curious, Filippo, in your context, how this happens.
Is more or less the same, but about authorities, you can just say no. In fact, they are just. It's not usual that the authority go search for people that they are. So no authority are not doing the research, and it's very rare that they are recovering the bodies. So we don't have. I mean, we to have some. Information about the let's say Tunisian authorities start to recover the collected for them the DNA of the remains, but in general is not something that they are doing, not research and not recovering the bodies. Maybe we'll go talking about this later, but so why they decide that the Alarm Phone Sahara network decide to work and how they decide to work. I was mentioning the fact that they don't have the GPS, etc. The families are, when the families start to search, I mean, it's very hard to focus in a specific area. In the U.S. Mexico border, you have a line. Let's say that the line is, as you mentioned, is a big line, but it's a line. When you leave Niger and you are crossing the desert and try to go in Algeria or in Libya, it's very hard to search. So for example, ICRC start a project a few years ago in order to work let's say movement segment. They start to say, okay, you are in Agadez, so you can go to the desk and call back your family and inform the family in order to say, I'm here. So the previous part of the trip is done. Okay, so if if I get lost in the future, it will be from this point to the Libyan coast, etc. So they start to work on this with the civil society actors. The problem that is very hard to intercept the cases in case of accident. Okay, if the smuggler, if the driver had the GPS, etc., they can launch the alert, so it's possible to go to search, but you are in a very, let's say, militarized zone. It's not easy to go and search for missing, so hard to do. And when so you have one person, two person that remain behind, it's very hard to provide to alert friends, because you are in the capacity to ask for help when you reach the next point, let's say. If it's a safe point, because if you are in Libya and you are intercepted by the Libyan authorities, ciao. They are not asking if someone is you left behind. So it's very hard, and what they are doing is more go and found the bodies and the remains. Not, it's very hard to find some, let's say, survivors in the desert after a few days, because the situation is not is very complicated for many reasons that you probably know about desert, but and the distance are big, so it's very hard to find. So they are finding remains, and they are not the civil society. They don't have the capacity to recover the body. So what they are doing is to let's say, to fix the GPS position, record the position, and just try to catch some information, very, very basic, let's say, forensic procedures, some possible information, and try to collect information from other people on the move, and that's it. They are just I have a few images of the how they bury the bodies. They just cover the bodies, and the body just disappeared, and we have just a position where the person died. So the context is very hard. So what they are trying to do is prevent in order to inform and try to, but for the moment, because of the non-capacity, so the problem with the GPS and the connection is very hard to it's not easy to have the capacity to intervene and save people. Okay, so this is the big problem. This is the reason why we don't have numbers. The numbers are very, very and we suppose that we have many victims in the desert who just disappear, and we are just counting like a arithmetic count from people who search for families and people just lost. So the situation is quite hard, and we are trying to work with the Alan Sahara Friends and other associations in order to find a way to say create a kind of practices and using technologies in order to prevent. But this is the situation.
Is there a growing mobilization of families who are looking for their missing?
Yeah, the family.
I mean, this is something that we have seen in the last 10 years in Latin America, and Mexico, and Central America. Is just blew up. It's like there is hundreds and hundreds of collectives of mothers who are looking for either missing sons or migrants, and that itself is kind of creating a kind of vernacular forensics or citizen forensics that some people call it, in which a lot of the knowledge is being shared, and and searches are organized, and some of these kind of institutional complications, the complicity of authorities very often that we have in the Mexican case is that you cannot count on authorities on investigating many of these cases because some of them were involved in the very disappearance or in this what they call the secondary or the second disappearance of the remains. So remains that have been found and then are re-disappear by state authorities, right? And so, but I'm interested to know more about how this movement of families searching for the loved ones is growing in different sub-Saharan countries.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
to
sorry.
do a quick answer. We have, we are trying to map the mobilization. We are doing a project with the Euromed, right? We are mapping the different actors of the civil society, more the association, but they have the connection with the local communities and groups, etc. So the idea is to map the situation, the mobilization, when the same with the commemoration process. But the idea to be in touch and try to do the connection easier. It's working more in the transnational situation. So people who get missed in Balkans, and we are mobilizing our organization in Morocco, for example. This is working because the conditions are easier. The searching area is easier. For the desert, for the mountain, it's very hard to. So we know probably more than we know the names. We have some information about the situation of disappearance, but the possibility to find the body and recover the body, etc., is very low. And it looks like that's why we are saying that the Mediterranean Sea is quite the same. The number of disappearances is very big with respect the numbers of body we can recover.
The issue around identification and forensic services in the U.S., I think is one of the bigger contributing factors behind why many families have a missing person rather than someone that they know have died. So I think it's a hugely an issue that we really have not paid enough attention to. So I will first start with the local level, Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner. Let's not criticize let's always criticize all government, right? But let's not assume that the county government are the same as the federal government. And here in Southern Arizona, we have really dedicated forensic anthropologists and forensic pathologists, and really the whole medical examiner at the county level is very dedicated to identifying the dead. I mean, they've been incredibly creative and innovative over the last 20 years. They've really taken this challenge on, and there's a lot of ethical work being done there. The challenges that I think that those forensic practitioners would agree with me are probably two big things. Number one, the U.S. Missing persons system is dominated by law enforcement. So the whole, tradition of how to report a missing person, all roads lead back to law enforcement. And what that ends up doing is it means for some of these really great systems that are being funded by the federal government that can help families of missing people, effectively migrants are excluded. And in the interest of time, I won't go into exactly why unless somebody has a question. It has to do with language, fear, but a number of reasons why basically families of missing migrants are effectively excluded from some of the bigger systems and services for missing persons in the US. So that's one of the issues. And then the other is just how incredibly massive and transnational the scale of disappearance is. So if you were to look at disappearance in the Americas, it's just incredibly complicated. I mean, Mexico disappearance from Central America through Mexico in the Sonoran Desert. A number of families, I don't know what percentage, but many families don't know if their loved one disappeared in Mexico or in Arizona, for example, and then figuring out where to report. And the families, of course, are reporting everywhere because there's no centralized system. And so the data is just really complicated, and it's very difficult to feel, if you have an unidentified set of remains, to feel like you know exactly how you can compare that data against all of the missing persons reports. It's really complicated. So I'll stop there.
Let's say the first, I'm talking about the desert and the Niger or Chad or Libyan authorities. So we start to find some mass graves. So the idea to ask to to the state to work on this is not exactly easy. So the process of identification, recovering remains and identification in the desert is not a process because of the lack of capacities and lack of volunteers. So it's not working for the moment. I know that there is a kind of they are trying to implement the capacity in Tunisia, for example, from the authorities, or in Morocco, etc. But more about the people who died at the sea. But same, there is a problem about I mean, all the step of the process from the recovering of the bodies, etc. is just very, very complicated for the structural reasons, I think, and for the political reason.
Sorry, did you say that some of these discoveries were of mass graves?
Yes, there is a mass graves discovered by the
So is that a slightly different type of phenomena than we are? In other words, it's not an individual migrant who gets sick or lost and dies, but kind of is the action of a criminal or war system that buries them in Mexico. Are they underground?
Yes. There is. They found some mass graves in Libya, and we don't know. I mean, the situation. Okay, but I can ask the same question about the 90 people who died in Algeria, etc. Where they are buried, we don't know. So probably is a different.
But they are believed to be migrants, or could they?
We are talking about migrants. Migrants who are detained, migrants who try to escape, migrants, etc. So many, or there. But I was mentioning the case of accident. So if you have a truck with 45 people who died in the desert, I cannot say that the Niger authorities or the Algerian authorities start the process of identification. Probably the body will go, So this is the way of the normal way of the management of the bodies was very, very critical, but we are far from the capacity to do something in terms of implementation of the system, of technical system, one side, and the political. So I'm trying to explain to the authorities. Very hard. But yeah, no, I saw that Charles mentioned the fact that there is at the European level that is they are trying to force to ask the state to implement the system of identification, etc. This is true, but the problem is that I mean, one is the level, the capacity of the system and the political volunteer to identify, because the identification is not mandatory. They are, I mean, in Italy, for example, the identification of the body is mandatory only if the persecutor asks for it. If not, they are just barring people under, as not identified. So you are barred as unidentified. We have a family searching for you, but the family is in Mali or is in Niger. So it's very hard to connect, let's say, the three-step. This is something we are working on it. The steps of, I mean, the missing galaxy, the events, and the management of the bodies, the burials, etc. It's very hard to do it in the transnational and transcontinental scape. Because this is one of the characteristics who makes the job very, very hard for the civil society actors, etc. Because we are not talking about. I think it's not easier, but it's the scape is more clear in the U.S. Mexican border, because you are on both sides, and maybe you maybe have traces of the person before the border, so maybe you can search for him. in the, let's say, transcontinental migration start to be, it's quite hard. So the idea is to work on this segmentation of movements and trajectories, but with the help of the civil society and the communities of migrants.
And what it seems, yeah, it's like to a very large extent is migrant themselves and who are crucial in trying in securing the path towards where they are going. In other words, if you're saying that a system, every time you reach a point where you can make a call, do so that we know not to look for you. So in a way, already anticipating that you might disappear or die along the route, and
It's completely crazy as a concept, but yes,
yeah.
it
I
is
think that's
something.
definitely happening in the Mexican case as well. I'm curious. I'm gonna end here, but there is the other figure here, which is what you were talking about, the paseur or the smuggler. And there is different ways in which smugglers are often criminalized or made responsible for some of these. Together with the desert or the elements or the ocean. Another kind of, I think, common narrative is to say, well, smugglers abandon them to die, or smugglers put them in this risky situation, which, I mean, I'm sure it happens, but it's also true that smuggling networks or migration facilitating networks also have developed over the years strategies to try to make the movement safer and to monitor it and have all these different, and maybe some of the answers come from that structure. Some of the strategies for identification and location should come from a dialogue with
For sure. Just
right?
just as a sentence, the few information we have, the few numbers we have, the figures we have is during the period in Niger where the law, criminalized smuggling was applied, the number of missing increased. It's yeah, we are learning a lot from your experience, Robin, and the experience of the U.S. Mexico border. Is very important. The self-organization of families is very important for us. What is harder is try to do it as a transcontinental network. So this is something we are trying to develop with friends, civil society organization, etc., in order to support families. But we start from your experience. So yeah. Thank you.
Well, and thank you. I really appreciate learning what your context is. It's so different, but a lot of shared challenges. We should be in dialogue more. Hard with the time difference, but something I can share with you all. There's a recent article by her last name is Toribio. I'll think of the co-authors in a moment, but something that's often been lurking in the back of my mind about our approach, with the medical examiner, with the Argentine forensic anthropology team, with Colibri Center for Human Rights is now closed, but with all of that work on the border, that is there we can't solve this issue for families through identification. It addresses one question, maybe, if the forensic results are translated for the family and if they are involved in the process and they are able to incorporate those results into their own narrative, right? But I think your context really forces the question, like, what are the other responses? Because forensics is not it in every circumstance. Forensics can really become a colonial practice if we decide, oh, okay, here's a problem, and the answer or the medicine is always forensics. It gets to be like a medicalization. And sometimes the answer is maybe something else. And in the Mediterranean and with the Saharan context, it just makes me think about, like, what are those other practices that I don't know if you know anything about this, but like do you know anything about how our families coping with, ambiguous loss and disappearance? Are there practices to care for the dead outside of forensics, to care for the families outside of forensics? Since in your case, there's no possibility of identification for most of the people.
No, you're right. I mean, we start to consider an idea of, let's say, holistic approach of forensic. not only medical and not only, let's say, monopolized by the authorities. So try to involve more the civil society, etc. And they are asking sometimes for the, let's say, traditional forensics and not, let's say, DNA, etc. So there is a kind of even technical, ideological struggle between the two different approach on the forensic approach. And we see it just to give you an example about the internal border of Europe, we start to record many cases of ambiguous, let's say, identification. We are writing a paper with Karolina Kobylinski, who was working as my colleague, about the fact that we have many cases of body identified because they left, let's say, biometrical information in the hotspot in Lampedusa, etc. So when they died in the internal borders, like in Ventimiglia, etc., they are identified as bodies. Okay, so the body who we recorded in Lampedusa died in Ventimiglia. So the process for the forensics in terms of identification of the body is working, but the family are not. So we are not identifying the person because is not the real name. The family don't know about the fact that the relative died. So there is disruption. So rupture between the identification of the bodies and the identification of the person. And there is something we are trying to understand, and problematize a bit. So
that's super interesting. I want to read that paper. Will you please send it when it's
when it's done? Yeah,
I really want to read it. I'll put the article I was mentioning in the chat if anybody's interested. The PDF is there.
Thanks.
And I just appreciate what they are doing in this article, kind of problematizing this assumption that what we always need is more forensics. Yeah, yes, and I agree. I'll just start really quick, Filippo. The journalism along the border has been super important. I would say generally less so when it comes to the specific work of forensics and this identification work. I see journalists a little bit more, they're not really there. And frankly, I have some critiques of dominant journalism about this issue, and I'll be very clear, and succinct in the interest of time, that I think it's time for journalists to be focusing the lens up in terms of power and less on suffering and less on people who have less power. And I'm very, very tired at this point, to be honest with you, about the dramatic, horrific suffering and terrible language about the dead and graphic images. And it just became like a journalistic industry for a while to exploit the dead, dramatic, sensationalist journalistic articles. So I do think we have a problem, and I don't think it helps. The current political situation, it doesn't really help to publicize graphic, dehumanizing details of powerless people's deaths. I don't think it's useful. So obviously I have some gripes about that part of it and critiques, but I think the role of journalism is incredibly important. I love the reporting from The Intercept and other local journalists and writers who have studied up. So Paco Cantu, I see you there. And I would call out your book and work like that studies up as really, really important for this context.
No, I agree with you, and I think it's important to. We are working with many good journalists who has friends who are focusing the topic, but they are investigating the responsibilities too. So there is a kind of. I mean, I think it's. I don't know the let's say North American context, but we can have this. We have here the support of many friends, journalists who are pointing the responsibility of states, etc. So they help a lot. I give you an example. Fabrizio Gatti was a great journalist in Italy. Helps us to help the civil society to for example, to explain the shipwreck of 18th of April 2013 with the responsibility of the Italian and Maltese Navy. So they can do a very important work of investigation. So they can help families, they can help this is so I just mentioned this one, but there is many in our, let's say, Mediterranean and North African region. But it's difficult, it's hard, because now you are talking about Tunisia or Libya, what's happening in Tunisia. It's not easy if you are a journalist there to testimony, to denounce. Here I shared the very interesting, very, I mean, good work of Taina Tervonen, for example, working with the families in the of missing. So there is many good journalists who are in touch with working on the topic. And then you have a journalistic approach that's like a more mainstream accounting and just and using the words. We have focusing even in the clandestine. So we have a very big problem about the lexicon the journalists are using to talk about the migration in general and about the missing. To say, you mentioned the desert, the sea. The sea is something. The reason is it's crazy how they can hide in a certain way the responsibility of the states and the border regime. So yeah, there's a journalist and journalist.
Good question. First, again, to be clear, the data that I'm showing is specifically from one county government. So I'm not even trying the particular data that I work with is from the county. So that's why you see that jurisdictional line. There's two efforts. So one, there's a migrant death working group that's working on getting a more complete count on the U.S. side, but for all of the different states. And then Natalia and I we worked on trying to grasp what mapping could look like that would present a more binational view of the Sonoran Desert in terms of deaths. And it's very complicated. So Natalia, I don't know if you want to mention anything on the Sonoran side.
Well, I mean, something that is interesting that we can share is the fact that search groups in the U.S. and buscadoras and madres buscadoras in Mexico, even though it might seem that the causes of the disappearance of the people they are looking for are different. In other words, and this is what I was bringing up with Filippo, in the Mexican case, most of these are victims of enforced disappearance who have been deliberately disappeared. In other words, they have been killed and buried in clandestine mass graves by either criminal groups or state authorities or a mix of them. And that's kind of the big bulk of what the buscadoras are doing. And this is why their tools are kind of these, the I don't know what you call it in English, but the steel bar that you put in on the ground so that you can see if there are human remains underneath. What is it called?
Probe.
The probe. So like all of their techniques and knowledge is kind of oriented towards just tracking and finding people, but also trying to see if they are buried in that area or burnt or sort of disappear the remains in some other way. And so, which is quite different from what the search and rescue groups are doing in the Arizona side, which has more to do with trying to go to these remote areas where migrants hide themselves, and that also makes it very difficult to retrieve their remains because they were kind of trying to hide in the first place, of course. So the contexts are different, but the groups are connecting. The groups are already connecting, and some, and often because of what you mentioned, that many families in Central America, for example, don't know if their relative did cross the border and disappear once in the United States, or didn't make it across the border and disappear in Sonora. And so the search has to be binational necessarily, and it has to mobilize these different types of efforts and search techniques. And so the groups are connecting. Madres Buscadoras de Sonora has a particular sort of group of Madres Buscadoras de Sonora in Arizona, which is related to SOS Búsqueda y Rescate in Arizona. And so they kind of are more and more in contact. And once they're, if a person is reported as missing, they start calling the consulates and the shelters and the albergues in Mexico and the hospitals and the prisons and the search and rescue groups. And so I think the efforts are merging to a certain extent. But I think, I mean, this could be done in a more sort of systematic and kind of thorough way, right? But it's happening.
I think, I mean, just thinking about what you are saying, and it's I was talking about, before about the difficulties, but interest to connect the missing clusters of groups of people, the event that you can map, you can point, and the remains recovering, etc. It's easier in the Mediterranean Sea. It's easier because we have a group of people on the same boat. And so if you have one contact of one person, you can probably reconstruct the group and collect, the cluster of missing, etc. So this is something we are trying to do with the help with the NGOs at the sea. So there is a kind of logic of, I just shared the thinking about the Jose Pablo sentence. The logic of complex network analysis was an approach very interesting in order to search for a group of people. So the idea to work with groups in order to understand if one person from the group disappear, etc. So this is a logic. When you have this, when you don't know where the people are and when you harder, so you need to find a different approach and different methodology probably in order to enforce the families, in order to be able to search, let's say, better and be more in touch with the local actors.
Yeah, and if I understand correctly, so in this complex network analysis, also what it does is that migrants themselves become key sources of evidence for looking for each other, right? Sort of in these groups.
I think it's very different from the situation from in Tunisian last few years, 2 years. There is more self and autonomous movement with the small boats, etc. So it's not managed by, let's say, there is a traffic. I think we can talk about traffic. We know about the traffickers, and there is a different levels of facilitators or smugglers. So it's different. Then you have the coxer, the people who, I mean, put some groups of people from nationality to in a boat. So there is a very complex dynamics, and they know the names of the people. Sometimes they know the so the capacity of the civil society to be in touch, or the family to be in touch with someone. So there's a kind of chain of trust and communication in order to be able to know if the person you are looking for left a trace, let's say in the Libyan beach before to leave, etc. So the idea of chain of trust and chain of because you are working in a borderland, very dangerous, very everybody is very diffident. I don't know. So yeah, there is a. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah, the idea is it's a step of safe steps of information. I give you. I mean, we can discuss of concrete cases, for example. So the idea of we have a case we are trying to work on. It is a case of two different boats separate by the Libyan the Libyans. And one boat is a ghost shipwreck with no traces about. We have just SOS Mediterranean NGOs found some bodies at the sea in a moment, but it's without the capacity to recover the bodies, so nothing. But we discovered that the other boat was traveling together, and the second one was intercepted by the Libyan authorities. So we reconstructed this logic of complex analysis, the all groups before the Libyans split the groups, and by the connection with the family, we are trying to reconstruct the second group of the ghost shipwreck. So one of the problem we have is let's say try to work on the objectivation of the disappearance. It's another big problem we have. So the idea, how can we prove and how can we inform the family that the person had just disappeared in the sea, for example, try to give them some concrete information to answer the question. Yeah.
Especially concrete information where you have no remains, which is the hardest. I think that's
This is the hardest, for
the
sure.
entire mobilization in Mexico is just to have the remains so you can bury them in a dignified place, put flowers, mourn them. In a way, that's the kind of the impulse driving the whole effort, no? Is to have the remains. So it's very hard when you communicate to the families, this person disappeared and we have no remains.
And I think the disappearance for the Mediterranean, for the desert, for the Sahara Desert is the bigger problem now, because many persons are just disappearing.
Mm-hmm. And in a certain way, they never, like there's always this hope that they might come back somehow, for the families, right? Like there's no proof.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the areas where the family association, the family committees are so important, because they can really share the experience and the education and the mutual support.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and there is a point of mutual support and connection, and this is very important. And I think we can, I would like to add one word about the fact that we are, the capacity to, the idea to search the groups allow us to point the political issue more than the authority manage the case of identification of missing case by case, person by person, family by family. They are splitting and you are only on the individual management of the case. So what the idea to engage the families and put together the families and create the cluster of the missing connected to the event is important also for politicize the situation, because if they disappear because they are crossing the sea and they are not, so this is another point who's in our situation is very important.
Yeah, to give it a public, a collective, a kind of group significance. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's where we end. Thank you so much all for being here. We look forward to seeing you in the next session of our Deserting Talk series, and to keep in touch. And hopefully, Filippo, Robin, we can maybe continue this conversation with other people related to this issue. And I think this is just the beginning of transcontinental, transnational
We need it.
dialogue.
All
Yeah,
of
we
these
need it.
opportunities are so helpful. So Filippo, it's really good to talk with you. I'm going to email you. I want to ask you about something. So
yeah, no, we are in touch, so let's keep discussing. Thank you so much. It's very important for me, and I will try to follow the next meeting, because it's very interesting for me and for our, sorry for the time. Many friends that say, okay, I would like to, but this is
Yeah, maybe in the future we can find more intermediate times that it's more like around noon here, so that it's not so late for you over there.
yeah, for me it's fine, but maybe I know from friends, Cristina del Biagio is a very good friend of me, and we are working together, but she's out now.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
thank you,
Ciao.
Natalia, Miguel. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take
Ciao,
care.
take
Be well.
care.